The road leading to the Broussard estate had long been swallowed by time and neglect. Twisted trees arched over the cracked dirt path like skeletal sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky as if to warn travelers away. Locals in the nearby town whispered cautionary tales, often ending with a hollow laugh and a shake of the head. Few dared to step foot past the overgrown gate, and fewer still returned to tell their stories. It was said that the Broussard family had once been prominent, their wealth sprawling across acres of fertile land, but rumors of madness, disappearance, and worse had driven them into obscurity. Eleanor Price, a young historian with a fascination for forgotten families and the shadows they leave behind, had heard whispers of the Broussard estate years before. She had always thought the stories exaggerated, the kind of folk legend meant to scare children and thrill idle gossips. But as she drove the final stretch of the winding road, the air thick with mist and the scent of decay, Eleanor felt a shiver crawl up her spine. The house loomed ahead, its silhouette jagged against the twilight sky, windows dark and vacant, like hollow eyes. The front gate, rusted and groaning on its hinges, seemed less like an entrance and more like a warning. Eleanor parked her car at the edge of the property and stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath her boots. A sudden gust of wind rattled the brittle leaves, and she felt, inexplicably, as though unseen eyes were tracking her every movement. She reminded herself that this was her profession, to explore, to document, to uncover truths buried in time. The estate would yield stories, she told herself, and perhaps even secrets long buried by the family's sinister reputation. The path to the front door was narrow and overrun with weeds. Eleanor navigated carefully, brushing past thorny vines that seemed to pull at her clothes as though unwilling to release her. The house was larger than she had anticipated, its architecture once grand but now crumbling under the weight of neglect. The wood of the porch creaked with each step, a warning she ignored. Driven by a mixture of curiosity and defiance, she placed her hand on the massive front door, its surface scarred and splintered. The key, an old brass piece she had found in a nearby antique shop rumored to have belonged to the family, fit perfectly. With a turn, the lock gave a reluctant groan, and the door swung inward, revealing darkness that seemed to breathe. The air inside smelled of damp wood, mildew, and something else, something metallic, faint but persistent, like dried blood. Eleanor's flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating faded wallpaper peeling from the walls and furniture draped in white sheets, ghostly in their stillness. Dust motes floated in the beam like tiny spirits, disturbed from their long slumber. Every step she took echoed through the empty halls, bouncing off walls lined with cracked portraits of stern faces, generations of Broussards staring down at her with unsettling intensity. It wasn't long before Eleanor noticed the first anomaly, a series of shallow scratches along the hallway floor, almost imperceptible but arranged in a pattern that suggested deliberate action. She knelt to examine them, the hairs on her arms standing on end. They were too methodical to be random. They spoke of some ritual, some code left behind by hands long gone. Her fingers traced the grooves, and a strange warmth seemed to creep up from the floor, as if the house itself was alive, aware of her intrusion. Upstairs, the bedrooms revealed more of the family's macabre past. Old trunks sat in corners, their lids warped but locked tight. Eleanor pried open one and found an assortment of journals, brittle and yellowed. The handwriting inside was precise, almost obsessive, chronicling daily events, family disputes, and the gradual descent into obsession and cruelty. One entry, dated over a century ago, detailed a dinner that read more like a ceremonial event than a meal, mentioning guests who would never leave, and the preservation of the family bloodline. Eleanor felt a chill settle deep into her bones as she realized the family's dark reputation was no mere legend. It had been lived, recorded, and perhaps even celebrated. As the night deepened, the house seemed to shift around her. Shadows, pooled where light should have been, and faint noises, scratches, whispers, the soft creak of floorboards, echoed in rhythm with her own heartbeat. Eleanor told herself it was her imagination, the product of isolation and the unsettling nature of the estate. Yet, as she passed the old library, a single book fell from a shelf with a dull thud, landing open on the floor as though inviting her gaze. The text inside was cryptic, filled with diagrams and annotations in margins that spoke of rituals, lineage, and something Eleanor could not yet comprehend. A sudden draft extinguished her flashlight, plunging her into darkness. Eleanor froze, straining her ears. There it was, a whisper, soft and almost playful, yet laden with menace. She could not discern words, only a presence that seemed to linger just beyond the edge of perception. Her rational mind fought to convince her it was the wind, or perhaps a rodent disturbed in its hiding place. But instinct screamed otherwise. The house, the estate, and the very walls seemed alive, waiting for her to stumble, waiting for her to make a mistake. Eleanor took a deep breath, reigniting the flashlight, its beam cutting through the black like a blade. She realized in that moment that the stories had not exaggerated the horror of the Broussard family. They had merely hinted at it. This house, this forgotten homestead, was more than a decaying relic of the past. It was a living testament to a darkness that had endured for generations, a darkness that might not yet be finished. And as Eleanor stepped deeper into the house, she understood that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no turning back. The Broussard legacy was waiting, and now so was she. The air inside the Broussard estate had grown colder, as though the house itself exhaled icy breath whenever Eleanor paused in the hallways. Each step seemed amplified in the silence, the groan of the floorboards beneath her feet echoing off, the walls lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her every move. It was impossible, Eleanor knew, but some part of her could not deny the sensation of being watched, observed by generations long gone. She reminded herself to keep her rational mind intact, but even as she spoke comforting words to herself, the shadows seemed to twitch and stretch with a life of their own. She moved cautiously toward the staircase leading to the attic, a section of the house locals had always avoided. The rumors had said the Broussards kept their darkest secrets above, sealed away from prying eyes. The narrow stairwell smelled of rot and decay, and cobwebs clung to her hair and clothes. As Eleanor climbed, the air seemed thicker, heavier, carrying with it the faintest whisper of voices, low, hissing, indistinct. She paused, straining to listen. The whispers were fragmented, almost teasing, forming words that were just out of reach, like echoes of thoughts trapped in the walls themselves. When she reached the attic door, she hesitated. The brass doorknob was cold to the touch, sending a jolt up her arm. She pushed it open, the hinges squealing a long, mournful cry. Inside, the attic was cloaked in darkness, illuminated only by the weak beam of her flashlight. Dust motes floated in the air, disturbed by her entrance, and the smell of decay was stronger here, laced with something metallic and bitter that made her stomach churn. Boxes and crates were stacked haphazardly, their contents spilling over with relics of a past Eleanor could only begin to imagine. Old clothing, brittle letters, strange masks carved from wood, and small jars filled with preserved substances that glistened under her flashlight. Everything felt deliberately hidden, waiting for someone curious enough to uncover it. As Eleanor sifted through the crates, she heard it again, the whispers, this time closer. They came from the far corner of the attic, where a large trunk sat covered in dust. The sound was subtle, almost like the creaking of a floorboard, but threaded with words that seemed to curl into her ears. Leave. Leave now. You shouldn't be here. She froze, her pulse hammering in her temples. Rational thought collided with instinct. It would have been easy to dismiss them as tricks of the wind or the house settling, but Eleanor felt the unmistakable weight of intent behind the voices. Someone, or something, was aware of her presence. With trembling hands, she opened the trunk. Inside were journals, photographs, and objects that seemed ceremonial. One photograph in particular caught her eye, A family portrait taken decades earlier, showing the Broussards arranged in front of the very house she now explored. The faces in the photo were stern, almost grotesque in their intensity. Their eyes seemed to follow her, unblinking, as if recording her intrusion. The journals were lined with entries that chronicled the family's obsession with secrecy and purity. Some passages described punishments for disobedience, strange rituals, and a reverence for traditions that chilled Eleanor to her core. The Ain family, it seemed, had lived in a world entirely their own, a world of darkness that had been carefully hidden behind the veneer of wealth and respectability. As she flipped through the pages, the whispers grew louder, no longer distant, but circling around her. The words became more distinct, sharp enough that she could almost understand them. They see you. They know. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The attic seemed to contract around her, the shadows thickening and pooling in corners, as though the darkness itself were breathing. Her flashlight flickered, threatening to plunge her into blackness, and she realized that whatever presence haunted the house did not want her to leave. A sudden movement in the corner of the attic made her spin around. Nothing was visible at first, only shadows dancing in the corners of her vision. But then she saw it, a shape tall and thin, retreating into the darkest corner, indistinct yet unmistakably humanoid. Eleanor's rational mind screamed that it was a trick of light, a hallucination brought on by fear, yet her instincts knew better. The air was charged with electricity, tension, and menace. She could feel eyes on her from every direction, pressing in, judging, waiting for her to falter. Despite the terror, Eleanor pressed on, feeling compelled to explore further. The trunk yielded more secrets, small carved figurines, each grotesque in design, resembling people in positions of agony or ritualized submission. They were crafted with exquisite care, almost lovingly, yet they radiated a sense of malevolence that made Eleanor's skin crawl. It was as though the Broussards had sought not merely to record their world, but to control it, to shape it into something dark and eternal. A sudden cold breeze swept through the attic, extinguishing her flashlight completely. Eleanor's heart leapt into her throat as the whispers became clearer, almost conversational. "You shouldn't be here. They will see. You are marked." Panic surged, but she forced herself to take a deep breath, reigniting the flashlight with trembling hands. The attic appeared empty, but the sense of presence lingered, oppressive and inescapable. Eleanor realized that the house had a memory, that the walls themselves retained echoes of the horrors committed within. And now, she had awakened them. In the dim light, she noticed faint scratch marks along the floorboards leading toward a trapdoor she hadn't seen before. The wood seemed worn, as if many had stepped there over the years, yet she had never noticed it in any account of the estate. Eleanor hesitated, the whispers circling her like a predator. This door, she realized, led deeper into the house's secrets, into the domain the Broussards had reserved for themselves. Her curiosity battled with her fear, but the pull of discovery was irresistible. She knelt to examine the trapdoor, brushing aside dust and cobwebs. The scratches along the floor seemed to beckon her, urging her to descend into darkness. Eleanor's hand rested on the latch, her fingers icy despite the warmth of the night. The whispers had become a chorus, a symphony of voices insisting, pleading, warning. And as she took a deep breath and pulled open the trapdoor, a cold, fetid wind rose from below, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of decay, the scent of something long dead, yet not at rest. Eleanor knew in that moment that she had crossed a boundary. Whatever lay beneath the attic was a threshold into the heart of the Broussard family's darkness, a place few had ever glimpsed, and fewer still had survived to recount. And as she descended, the shadows seemed to stretch taller, leaning in closer, whispering in voices both human and inhuman, "Welcome to the true world of the Broussard." The trapdoor closed behind Eleanor with a dull thud, sealing her descent into a subterranean realm that smelled of damp earth and something far fouler, an odor that clung to her clothes and hair like a curse. The narrow staircase spiraled downward, into darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the feeble beam of her flashlight. The air grew heavier, almost viscous, carrying with it a sensation that pressed against her chest with each step. Eleanor felt the oppressive weight of centuries bearing down on her, a suffocating presence that whispered of deeds long forgotten by the outside world, but not by the house itself. At the bottom, she stepped into a cavernous space, the walls lined with jagged stone that glistened in the faint light. The room was arranged with chilling precision. Wooden tables, instruments she could not name, jars filled with substances that swirled in unnatural colors, and shelves stacked with books, bound in cracked leather. Many of the books had strange symbols etched into the covers, and the pages within were thick with cryptic diagrams, annotations, and accounts of rituals that defied comprehension. Eleanor's hands shook as she traced the symbols with her fingertips, recognizing in them a meticulous devotion to obsession, control, and a dark vision of family perfection. It was in the center of the room that Eleanor first encountered what truly defined the Broussard lineage. A wall of portraits, more grotesque than those above, depicted generations of the family, each painting more distorted than the last. Faces elongated, eyes sunken or unnaturally bright, expressions twisted in ways that suggested a life lived in constant, creeping madness. Notes scrawled along the edges of the paintings revealed what Eleanor had feared. The family prized purity, of blood above all else, practicing a system of inbreeding and rituals intended to preserve what they considered an unbroken line of superiority. The obsession was both clinical and fanatical, recorded with an almost loving precision that chilled her to the bone. Among the journals and manuscripts scattered across the tables, Eleanor discovered letters written to one another, detailing the progression of the family's most infamous members. One letter, written in a hurried, jagged hand, recounted the treatment of a child who had been considered impure, detailing the methods used to correct or eliminate the perceived flaw. The language was clinical, almost tender, but the meaning was horrific. Discipline, restraint, and horror were celebrated as necessary for the preservation of the family line. Eleanor could hardly believe her eyes, yet each page reinforced the brutal truth. The Broussards were not merely eccentric or cruel. They had devoted themselves to a philosophy of darkness, one that treated human life as a malleable instrument of obsession. The more she read, the more the shadows in the room seemed to thicken, pressing closer as though drawn to the exposure of their secrets. Whispers circled her, soft but insistent, and for the first time Eleanor realized she could discern multiple voices speaking at once, overlapping in a cacophony of accusation, warning, and amusement. It was not merely the house watching her. Now, it was the lingering consciousness of the family itself, embedded into every surface, every object. She felt their scrutiny as a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders, the brush of unseen eyes against her skin. A heavy chest at the far end of the room drew her attention. Its surface was carved with symbols she had seen in the journals, shapes that twisted unnaturally as her eyes traced them. With effort, she lifted the lid, revealing its contents. A collection of bones, carefully cleaned and arranged, some small enough to belong to children, others unmistakably adult. Eleanor recoiled, her stomach heaving, but she could not look away. Among the bones were amulets, talismans, and other objects of ritual, suggesting a reverence for the dead that bordered on worship. The realization hit her with the force of a hammer. The Broussards had not merely killed in the name of obsession. They had revered their own atrocities, enshrining them in objects, in symbols, in memory. Suddenly, a low, almost imperceptible hum filled the room. Eleanor turned slowly, and her flashlight revealed a figure at the far wall. A shadowy silhouette, indistinct but unmistakably human in shape. Her heart froze as the figure stepped closer, its movement deliberate, almost ceremonial. The whispers intensified, now coherent enough to make her ears ache. The blood calls. You have seen. You must join, or be claimed. Eleanor stumbled backward, her mind racing. Was it a person, a ghost, or a projection of the house's will? She could not tell, and the impossibility of distinction terrified her more than the sight itself. She ran toward the staircase leading back up, but the shadows seemed to lengthen, twisting and coiling in her path. The air itself grew heavier, as though she were moving through water. The whispering voices shifted, now mocking, coaxing, warning, their meanings overlapping and impossible to separate. Every instinct screamed for her to flee, yet the knowledge she had unearthed weighed on her. She could not leave, not yet. There was a story here, a lineage of horrors meticulously documented, and she had stumbled directly into its epicenter. At the top of the stairs, Eleanor paused, gasping for breath. The trapdoor above had closed silently behind her, but the oppressive presence followed, its weight pressing into her back like a tangible thing. She realized that the house, the family, and the shadows themselves were one entity, united in purpose and malice. The walls, the floors, the portraits, all were conduits of the Broussards' madness, and now she was entangled in their history, a participant in a legacy that had endured for generations. Eleanor sank against the wall, trembling as the voices subsided to soft murmurs, almost conversational in tone, yet every word dripped with the history of violence and obsession. She had glimpsed the truth. The Broussards' darkness was not incidental. It was deliberate, ritualized, and cultivated over centuries. Their bloodline was a living testament to obsession, cruelty, and horror, each generation building upon the sins of the last. And in that moment, Eleanor understood that she had crossed a threshold. The house had shown her the family's past, but the whispers implied something more terrifying. Their influence had not ended. It lingered, alive in the shadows, and it would follow her if she allowed herself to leave. She could not ignore it. She could not escape it. The Broussards were not merely history, they were a presence, and she had entered their world. Eleanor awoke to the faint scent of smoke curling through the cold air, an acrid tang that made her stomach twist. She realized she had slept, or perhaps fainted, on the worn floorboards of the attic, the journals and bones still scattered around her. Her flashlight flickered weakly, and the shadows around her seemed to pulse with an almost impatient rhythm, waiting for her to move. The whispers had quieted, but the sense of presence lingered like a living thing, curling into her thoughts with every breath. Drawn inexplicably, Eleanor followed a narrow corridor she had overlooked in her initial exploration. The walls were lined with faded tapestries, depicting scenes that at first seemed pastoral, until closer inspection revealed twisted figures hidden within the landscapes. Children with hollow eyes, adults contorted in agony, faces masked in grotesque smiles. The craftsmanship was exquisite, yet every fiber of her being recoiled from the imagery. Each step forward intensified the oppressive sense that she was walking through the private corridors of a mind that had long abandoned morality, a mind that had perfected cruelty. At the corridor's end, a heavy oak door blocked her path. It was different from the others, thicker, reinforced, adorned with iron studs and elaborate patterns that resembled a web. Eleanor hesitated, her instincts screaming that whatever lay behind it was the culmination of the family's darkness. And yet, the pull was irresistible. Slowly she pressed her hand against the cool surface, and a shiver ran through her as if the door itself recognized her intrusion. With a deep breath, she pushed it open. The room beyond was vast, larger than any space she had encountered in. The house, candlelight flickered from wrought iron chandeliers, illuminating a long table set with precision. The air was thick with the metallic scent she had noticed before, and she realized with horror that the remnants on the plates were not merely symbolic. They were human. The table was laid as though awaiting guests, and in each chair, the shadows of figures seemed to linger, blurred and shifting at the edges of perception. Eleanor's stomach turned violently, but fascination held her rooted to the spot. On the table, she saw journals and meticulously written notes that chronicled the family's most infamous gatherings. They described feasts held in honor of lineage and ritual, where the consumption of flesh was not an act of desperation, but a deliberate offering. These gatherings, Eleanor read, were ceremonies of preservation, consuming the bodies of outsiders and sometimes kin deemed unfit to honor the family's blood purity and cement their dominion over life and death. The entries were clinical yet reverent, detailing preparation, execution, and the selection of participants with chilling care. A sudden movement drew Eleanor's eyes to the shadows along the far wall. Figures coalesced from the darkness, faint, but unmistakable. She recognized them from the portraits she had seen. Tall, gaunt shapes, their presence emanating a cold authority. The whispers returned, now louder, their words distinct and menacing. "Join us. The feast is eternal. Your blood is ours." Eleanor stumbled backward, but the room seemed endless, and the shadows advanced with deliberate patience. They were not corporeal in the usual sense, but their essence pressed against her senses, as though the house itself had taken shape to protect this ritual space. Her gaze returned to the table, and she realized with dawning horror that the candles' flicker revealed more than food. Hidden in the shadows, she glimpsed jars containing preserved organs and small bones arranged in patterns she could not comprehend. Each item was labeled with names, dates, and notes, a catalog of life and death meticulously maintained. The Broussard had turned murder into devotion, sacrifice into an art form, and Eleanor, standing in the center of it all, felt the weight of their centuries-long obsession pressing down on her. Her mind raced, desperate to reconcile what she was, seeing with reason. These were not merely stories, they were instructions, records, and warnings. She flipped through one of the journals at the table, discovering a passage that chilled her to the bone. The flesh honors the blood. To partake is to preserve. To abstain is to weaken the line. None shall leave unmarked. Eleanor understood that the house had preserved these rituals not as memory, but as a living truth, waiting for someone to bear witness, to continue the cycle, or to fall prey to it. The shadows began to move more purposefully, their forms coalescing around the table. Eleanor's flashlight caught one of the shapes clearly, a figure in a chair at the head of the table, its features indistinct but human enough to recognize the twisted lineage of the Broussard family. It gestured, almost invitingly, as the whispers grew insistent. Sit, honor the line, partake, or be consumed. Eleanor's instincts screamed for her to run, yet something deeper, some morbid curiosity, some scholarly obsession, kept her rooted. The room was alive with intent, and she could feel it weighing every thought, every heartbeat. Suddenly, the air shifted. A candle flickered violently, and Eleanor saw, etched into the table's wood, names, hundreds of them, each marking a life taken, preserved, or honored in the family's unending rituals. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This was not merely a history of horror. It was a living ledger, growing, ever updated, marking the continuation of the family's darkness. And she, by her presence, had become part of it. The whispers crescendoed, overlapping, forming a chorus of voices both ancient and immediate. Your presence honors us. Your fear nourishes. Your blood will be remembered. Eleanor's pulse raced, and a cold dread settled in her chest. She realized that the Broussard family's legacy was not just in the past. It was a ritualistic presence that endured, a darkness waiting to be perpetuated. The feast was eternal, and the family's shadow reached further than she could imagine. Eleanor backed toward the doorway, only to find the shadows now fully coalesced, forming a wall of spectral forms, their whispers a constant pressure in her mind. The Feast of Secrets was not merely a record, it was a trap, a living testament to the horrors that the Broussards cultivated over generations. And as the shadows advanced, Eleanor understood with chilling clarity that escaping this room, this house, was no longer a matter of physical effort, but of surviving the legacy she had uncovered. The room seemed to close in, and the whispers merged into a single, relentless voice. You see us, you know us, now you are ours. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as the candlelight danced across the table, illuminating once more the remnants of centuries of ritualized horror. She knew deep down that the Broussard family's darkness was not merely a story to uncover. It was a force that would claim her if she faltered, a living tradition that demanded acknowledgement and obedience, and in that instant, Eleanor understood the true weight of the Broussard legacy. It was not merely history but a hunger, an ever-present darkness that consumed all who dared to witness it. Eleanor stumbled out of the feast room, her body trembling and her mind reeling from the horrors she had just witnessed. The shadows seemed to cling to her, slipping along the walls, twisting around the corners, as if they were extensions of the house itself. Each step she took toward the main hall made the floorboards groan and the walls creak, as though the house were breathing, alive, and aware of her every move. She realized with growing terror that this was no ordinary building. The Broussard estate was not merely a home. It was a predator, patient and deliberate, its heartbeat synchronized with her own. The corridor she had taken before now seemed unfamiliar, longer, distorted. The doorways appeared to shift subtly, their edges stretching as if the walls themselves were reshaping the house around her. Eleanor's flashlight flickered, casting jagged shadows that darted across the walls like crawling insects. She tried to steady her breathing, to rationalize what was happening. Perhaps exhaustion, perhaps fear, perhaps the whispers had driven her mind into hallucination. Yet instinct screamed otherwise. The house moved, shifted, and waited, anticipating her. Next step. As she advanced, Eleanor noticed subtle changes she had missed before. The portraits lining the hall now seemed to pulse faintly, as if the figures within were alive, breathing in rhythm with the oppressive weight in the air. She paused in front of one particularly large painting. A Broussard patriarch, his eyes, dark and glinting, seemed to follow her, lips twisted into a cruel smile. For a moment, she swore the figure's gaze flickered toward a side corridor she had never seen before, and an irresistible pull drew her toward it. The corridor ended in a narrow stairwell leading to the basement. Eleanor hesitated. The house felt thicker here, heavier, and the air pressed against her like water. She descended slowly, each step echoing in the cavernous space below. The walls seemed to hum, faint vibrations that penetrated her bones, resonating with the dread that had settled deep in her chest. Eleanor realized the house was no mere shell. It was a living entity, a vessel for centuries of obsession, cruelty, and ritual. Every creak, every whisper, every flicker of shadow was a pulse in the rhythm of its life. At the base of the stairs, Eleanor entered a narrow chamber lined with shelves, jars, and implements she had seen scattered in other parts of the house. But here there was a difference. The objects seemed arranged deliberately to channel energy, to focus the presence within the walls. Small fires smoldered in sconces, though there was no visible fuel. Candles flickered as if breathed upon by unseen lips. Eleanor felt the air thicken, heavy with the metallic tang of old blood, and something indefinably worse, a scent that suggested anticipation, predation, and hunger. She moved cautiously, noting faint grooves in the stone floor that formed intricate patterns, symbols she had seen in the journals but could not fully decipher. The shadows at the edges of her vision began to coalesce, stretching and slithering along the walls like living tendrils. Whispered voices swirled around her, murmuring, in multiple tongues, some human, some not. Eleanor realized the house was aware of her knowledge, reacting to her intrusion. The Broussard estate was not merely a setting for their horrors, it was the instrument of them, a vessel in which the family's obsession had been amplified, taking root in walls, floors, and ceilings, surviving beyond death. A sudden sound drew her attention, a low, rhythmic thudding from deeper within the basement. Eleanor's heart raced as she followed the sound, stepping carefully to avoid disturbing the house's subtle reactions. The thudding grew louder, more deliberate, like footsteps approaching, but irregular, almost as if something massive and unnatural moved beneath the floor. The shadows lengthened and thickened, responding to the rhythm, stretching across the walls to block her retreat. Eleanor understood then that the house itself hunted in concert with the lingering essence of the family. In the far corner of the chamber, she discovered a trapdoor, smaller than the previous one, almost concealed behind shelves of dusty tomes and jars. It seemed to breathe beneath her gaze, rising and falling subtly, as if inhaling and exhaling. Eleanor's pulse surged, but her curiosity overrode fear. She knelt, pressing her hand against the wood. The surface was warm, unnaturally so, pulsing, faintly under her touch. She realized, with dawning horror, that the house's life was concentrated here, a beating heart that had sustained the Broussards' rituals across generations. The trapdoor lifted easily under her hands, revealing a narrow tunnel that descended into blackness. A faint, damp breeze carried the whispers with it, merging into coherent words. "You cannot leave. You belong. Your fear feeds us." Eleanor's legs quaked, but she stepped forward, flashlight beam cutting through the tunnel's suffocating darkness. The air became denser, each breath a struggle. She felt the walls pulse around her, as though the house were constricting, testing her resolve, pressing her deeper into its living memory. Halfway through the tunnel, Eleanor noticed scratches along the stone walls, fresh yet ancient, as if generations of previous trespassers had marked their presence and their demise. She traced them with trembling fingers, understanding that the house was a record keeper, preserving not just objects and journals, but the very fear, despair, and pain of those who had entered. The walls seemed to respond, shifting slightly. Under her touch, the whispers crescendoing. The living cannot leave. The house remembers. The bloodline persists. Eleanor's flashlight flickered violently, and in that instant, she felt the house's will press against her directly. The tunnel walls contracted, not enough to trap her, but enough to remind her that she was entirely within its domain. The Ika whispers became a chant, echoing with the cadence of ritual. The darkness grows. The legacy endures. You are observed. She stumbled forward, heart pounding, mind racing, aware that every step she took was guided by the estate's consciousness. At the tunnel's end, Eleanor emerged into a chamber that made her blood run cold. The space was vast, circular, and lined with stone, with a ceiling so high it disappeared into shadows. At its center was a basin carved into the floor, filled with dark liquid that reflected her image like a rippling mirror. The air here was thick, heavy, vibrating with the pulse of centuries of obsession. Eleanor realized with horror that she had discovered the very core of the Broussard estate, the heart of its life, the vessel through which its darkness breathed and persisted. The whispers coalesced into a singular, resonant voice. You see us. You feel us. You cannot leave untouched. Eleanor's breath caught, her body trembling. The house was alive, more than walls and wood and stone. It was a creature of obsession and cruelty, shaped by the family's bloodline, and it had extended its consciousness through generations, waiting for witnesses, intruders, or heirs. She understood now that she was not merely exploring history. She had stepped into a living nightmare, and the estate would not release her until it had exacted its claim. And somewhere deep within the stones, Eleanor felt it pulse, a heartbeat, not her own, a presence that had endured centuries, inhaling and exhaling in time with the fear it cultivated. She shivered, knowing that the house, alive and sentient, was only the beginning. The circular chamber beneath the house pressed against Eleanor from every side, its oppressive presence suffocating, yet intoxicating. The liquid in the basin shimmered in the dim light, reflecting not her face, but a multitude of faces, fleeting and distorted, like smoke trapped in water. She blinked, and the images shifted. Children, adults, old men and women, all with hollow, accusing eyes, mouths frozen in silent screams. The whispers returned, louder, clearer. We are here. We never left. We remember. We hunger. Eleanor staggered back, nearly losing her footing on the slick stone floor, but she could not tear her gaze away. The shadows began to detach from the walls, rising slowly, as if the air itself had congealed into figures. They were indistinct at first, fluid masses of darkness that shimmered and reformed with every flicker of her flashlight. Yet as they solidified, Eleanor could see the telltale signs of humanity, hands, faces, postures, and she understood with a cold certainty. These were not mere shadows. They were the lingering remnants of the Broussard family's victims, their souls bound to the estate, trapped in a limbo of pain and terror, forced to witness the continuation of the horrors that had claimed their lives. One shadow drifted closer, its form more distinct than the others, A young boy, perhaps 8 or 9, his features pale and gaunt, eyes wide with fear. He raised a trembling hand toward Eleanor, as though pleading for salvation, but as she stepped forward, he dissolved into a swirl of darkness, only to reappear in another corner of the chamber, watching, waiting. The whispers intensified, overlapping, weaving a chorus of anguish and malevolence. "You are one of us now. The house remembers. The bloodline endures." Eleanor's mind reeled. She had seen the records, the journals, the artifacts, and yet nothing had prepared her for this. Living proof of the estate's enduring influence. The Broussard family's obsession had not died with them. It had fused with the house, anchoring the victims' spirits to its walls, creating a web of suffering that spanned generations. Each shadow seemed to embody the horrors inflicted upon them. Faces frozen in terror, hands clawing at invisible walls, mouths opening in screams that only whispered in the mind. The largest shadow emerged from the darkness, a towering figure, draped in tattered finery, its face obscured, but the posture unmistakably regal, as though it commanded the others. Eleanor recognized it immediately from the portraits she had seen upstairs, the patriarch of the Broussard line. Though he was nothing more than darkness and suggestion, his presence radiated authority and menace. The shadows around him shifted, bowing and recoiling, acknowledging his dominance even in death. The whispers coalesced into a singular, resonant tone. "You have seen our legacy. You know our hunger. Now you must witness the truth of the feast." Eleanor's pulse quickened. The chamber seemed to contract, walls pressing inward, forcing her attention toward the central basin. The dark liquid rippled unnaturally, and she realized it was not mere water, but a reflection of the accumulated suffering of centuries. The shadows around her moved in a slow, ceremonial rhythm, circling the basin as if performing a ritual that had continued uninterrupted for generations. Eleanor could feel the weight of their gaze, the unspoken demand that she participate, observe, and understand the depth of the family's depravity. As she watched, one of the shadows drifted toward the basin and reached into the liquid. Eleanor expected a scream, a splash, but instead, the shadow's form shimmered, blending with the dark surface, and she saw visions, feasts, punishments, rituals where the family consumed their victims in twisted ceremonies of devotion. She recoiled, tears stinging her eyes, but the shadows moved closer, their whispers now a chorus of insistence. "Do not turn away. You cannot deny us. You are one of the witnesses." Suddenly, the shadows lunged forward, not in violence, but in intent, pressing around her, enveloping her in darkness. Eleanor gasped, struggling to breathe, but she felt no hands on her, only a suffocating presence that penetrated her mind, filling her with visions of the family's atrocities, their meticulous obsession with bloodlines and the eternal cycle of hunger and fear they had created. The whispers became screams, and yet they were not audible. They resonated directly in her thoughts, a psychic imprint of centuries of horror. Eleanor fell to her knees, overwhelmed, her body trembling as the shadows pressed closer. She realized the truth. These spirits were trapped, bound to the estate by the rituals of the family, and the house had absorbed their suffering, shaping it into a living force. Each shadow was a fragment of the Broussard legacy, a piece of the darkness that had defined the family for generations. They had been denied rest, denied release, and now she understood why the house seemed alive, why the walls had whispered and moved. The estate was a vessel for their torment, a predator born of obsession and cruelty, and she was within its jaws. And then a new figure emerged from the darkness, a woman, tall and regal even in shadow, her presence commanding and terrifying. She reached out toward Eleanor, and the whispers stilled for a heartbeat, leaving only the heavy thrum of the estate's pulse. Eleanor felt a connection, a recognition, as if the woman were both guide and predator, offering understanding and warning simultaneously. Her mind filled with visions of the family's rituals, their feasts, their meticulous record-keeping of life and death, and Eleanor knew, with absolute clarity, that the shadows were not merely remnants. They were the living memory of the house, and they would not let her leave unscarred. Eleanor staggered backward, her breath coming in shallow gasps, and understood that the shadows were not simply present. They were active participants, shaping the estate's will, amplifying its influence, and ensuring that the horrors of the Broussard family endured. She could feel them pressing, whispering, judging, and she realized that escaping the estate would require more than physical effort. It would require navigating the consciousness of the house itself, a sentient entity formed from centuries of cruelty, obsession, and death. And as she rose, trembling and resolute, the shadows shifted again, forming a living circle around her. The woman in shadow spoke, a single voice rising above the murmurs. The legacy is alive. You have seen it. You know it. And now, so do we. Eleanor understood then that she was no longer merely an observer. She had become part of the house's history, entwined with the spirits of the dead, marked by the shadows, and forever connected to the living memory of the Broussard family. The estate had claimed her attention, the darkness had claimed her presence, and the shadows of the living dead would follow. Eleanor ran. The word echoed in her mind like a mantra as she scrambled up the stone staircase from the chamber of shadows, desperate for the air she remembered from outside, for the world she had left behind. But the estate refused to release her. The corridors twisted unnaturally, their length stretching and contracting as if the house were breathing around her, directing her, guiding her into its dark heart. Each turn brought her face to face with walls she did not remember, doorways that led to unfamiliar rooms, and the ever-present whispers that pressed against her mind. You cannot leave. The legacy remains. You belong. Panic clawed at her chest, yet she forced herself to think, to focus. The front door, the one she had unlocked hours before, must lead outside. It was her only hope. But the estate was no ordinary building. It had been a vessel for centuries of obsession, its very walls alive with intent. She reached the grand hall where her journey had begun, and the portraits of the Broussard family stared down at her, their eyes almost glowing in the dim light. They seemed different now, more vivid, as if they had awakened in response to her attempt to flee. The whispers became a low hum, almost musical, threading through her thoughts. You cannot leave. You are ours. You cannot escape. She bolted toward the door, but as she approached, the floorboards groaned and buckled beneath her feet. The door itself seemed to retreat into the wall, growing taller and more distant with every step. Eleanor skidded to a stop, her pulse racing, and realized with horror that the estate was reshaping itself around her, manipulating space to trap her within. Corridors she had memorized shifted, staircases led to nowhere, and the very hallways seemed to pulse with life, closing in around her like a predator circling its prey. The shadows surged from every corner, solidifying into forms both human and monstrous. The figures she had seen in the underground chamber, the patriarch, the woman in shadow, the boy, now appeared along the walls, their eyes glowing with an unearthly light. They did not move toward her with haste, but with patience, a quiet menace that suggested inevitability. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a chorus of warning and accusation. The living cannot leave. The bloodline persists. Your fear feeds us. Eleanor's mind raced. There had to be another way. Windows, side doors, the old service entrance. She darted down the grand hallway, her flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the suffocating darkness. The house responded to her movement, walls stretching, doorways disappearing, corridors elongating into impossibility. Every step forward was met with resistance, subtle yet undeniable, as if the estate itself were bending reality to keep her within its grasp. In a desperate gamble, Eleanor dashed toward a small window she had seen earlier in a library. She pushed at the frame, but it refused to budge. The shadows pressed closer, their presence heavier now, nearly tangible. She heard whispers directly in her mind, urgent, insistent. You cannot leave. Your blood has been touched by the legacy. It will follow you. She stumbled back, terror mounting as the realization struck her. The estate's power extended beyond mere architecture. It was woven into her consciousness, a psychological trap as lethal as any physical barrier. She tried another route, racing down the hall toward the front door once more, only to find the grand entrance replaced by a sheer wall of stone. Panic clawed at her chest as the estate's intent became undeniable. This was not a building. It was a sentient entity, a vessel of centuries of obsession and cruelty. It had observed her, learned her movements, anticipated her escape attempts, and now it was enclosing upon her. Her flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into total darkness. The shadows enveloped her, whispering incessantly, circling her with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Eleanor could feel their forms brushing against her skin, pressing, testing, probing. The whispers coalesced into a single voice, resonant and commanding. You see us. You know us. You cannot leave. You are ours. Desperation overtook her fear. She bolted blindly, hands scraping along walls she could not see, stumbling over steps, furniture, and the uneven floor. The house shifted with her, corridors twisting into impossible angles, doorways leading to the same room no matter which way she turned. Eleanor's mind reeled. There was no exit, no outside, no reprieve. The estate had become a living labyrinth, its walls infused with the legacy of the Broussard, each step forward a surrender to its will. And then, in a sudden, horrifying clarity, she understood. The Broussard estate had always done this. Any who entered became part of its story, trapped within the folds of space and shadow, witnesses and participants in the family's eternal ritual. Escape was an illusion. The house was alive, aware, and it would not release her because it could not. Its purpose was not merely to shelter or to preserve, but to claim, to mark, and to perpetuate the legacy. Eleanor sank to the floor, chest heaving, as the whispers receded slightly, leaving only the rhythmic pulse of the house's heartbeat. She realized that fleeing was impossible, that every attempt had been anticipated, woven into the design of the estate. The shadows lingered, patient, ever-present, reminding her that she was now part of the Broussard legacy whether she wanted to be or not. And in that moment, Eleanor understood the horrifying truth. The estate had claimed her not by force, but by inevitability. Escape was a lie. The darkness had already taken her, and the Broussard family's presence within the walls would follow her for the rest of her life, or perhaps beyond it. She could feel it deep within her mind, a pulse matching that of the house. The legacy endures. The darkness continues. You belong. Eleanor's vision blurred as she pressed her hands to her face, knowing that there was no relief, no freedom. The house had won, as it had for centuries. The legacy of the Broussard was eternal. Eleanor sat huddled in the corner of the grand hall, her body shaking, her mind frayed to its limits. The estate's pulse throbbed in time with her own heartbeat, a constant reminder that she was no longer merely a visitor, but a participant in the dark, living history of the Broussard family. The shadows hovered around her, patient, watching, whispering in a chorus of voices that blurred together into a single oppressive mantra. You are ours. You see the truth. You cannot leave. Hours, or perhaps days, passed. Eleanor had long since lost track of time. Sleep brought no relief. Every time she closed her eyes, the faces of the family and their victims swirled together in an endless parade of horror. The journals, the bones, the portraits, they haunted her relentlessly, whispering their secrets, pressing their knowledge into her mind. She had learned the full scope of the family's madness, the obsessive inbreeding, the ritual killings, the cannibalistic feasts, the manipulation of the living and the dead. Every generation had added its own layer of horror, and now she was trapped within it. Another mark in the house's ledger. In the dim light, Eleanor rose unsteadily, moving toward the central chamber where the basin of dark liquid waited. She could feel it calling to her, an irresistible pull that promised understanding, power, and annihilation all at once. The shadows followed, stretching across the floor, climbing the walls, their forms solidifying into shapes that were almost human. She knew that if she approached the basin, she would gain a connection to the estate, unlike anything she had experienced, but she also understood that doing so would bind her to the house forever. A figure materialized in the center of the chamber, the woman from the shadows she had seen before. Her presence radiated authority and menace, commanding the space as if she were both guardian and jailer. The woman spoke, her voice echoing in Eleanor's mind. "You have witnessed the legacy. You know the truth. Now you must choose. To resist is futile. To embrace is survival." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Survival. That word hung in the air like a lifeline, yet she sensed the cost. To embrace the legacy was to become part of the darkness, to inherit the obsession, cruelty, and hunger of the Broussards. But resistance promised only an eternity of torment within the living house, trapped with shadows and whispers, forever hunted by the family's lingering presence. Trembling, Eleanor stepped closer to the basin, her reflection rippling in the dark liquid. Faces of past victims swirled beneath the surface, some pleading, some accusing, some blank with despair. She felt their fear, their pain, their anger, as if the basin itself contained the essence of every soul the Broussards had claimed. The woman in shadow extended a hand toward her, and the whispers grew louder, urging, coaxing, demanding. Join. Inherit. Continue. Survive. Eleanor's mind screamed, but her body moved almost instinctively. She touched the surface of the liquid, and a surge of energy coursed through her. Memories of the family's rituals, their feasts, their meticulous obsession with bloodlines, flowed into her, overwhelming, yet intoxicating. She saw herself as part of the lineage, a thread woven into the tapestry of horror. The shadows circled her, welcoming, claiming, binding her to the house, and for the first time, Eleanor understood the full magnitude of the Broussard legacy. The chamber seemed to exhale, a long, shuddering breath that resonated through the stone walls. The estate had accepted her. She was no longer merely a witness. She was part of the story, another layer in the centuries-old web of darkness that defined the family. The whispers softened into murmurs of approval, and the shadows retreated slightly, as though acknowledging her new role within the house. Outside, the world continued, unaware of the horrors that lay hidden in the Broussard estate. But within the walls, the legacy endured, alive and conscious, shaped by obsession, cruelty, and the undying will of the family. Eleanor moved through the halls with newfound purpose, guided by the pulse of the estate, aware that every step, every breath, every thought now belonged to the house. In the darkness of the attic, the whispers persisted, now a constant companion, threading through her mind with the rhythm of the estate's heartbeat. The legacy remains. The darkness continues. You are ours. Eleanor understood at last that the house would never release her, that the shadows would never leave, and that the Broussard family's obsession would endure through her, as it had through generations before. She was no longer afraid. Resistance had ended. Acceptance had begun, and so the estate pulsed on, alive, sentient, eternal, carrying the legacy of the Broussard family into the future, with Eleanor as its latest witness, participant, and inheritor. The darkness remained, the shadows remained. The legacy remained, and in the silent heartbeat of the house, all was as it had always been.